one of the most shocking and horrific events in European history, saw the King of France, Louis XVI, be taken on a slow procession to the foot of the guillotine, the slanted bladed device which would take his head clean off. Louis XVI had been condemned to death for many crimes, including colluding with the enemies of the French, and also for treason and depleting the national treasury. It was on the 21st of January 1793 that the 38-year-old king was locked under the blade of the guillotine, and it took just one swift drop of the sharp blade for his head to be taken off. After the blade fell, cannons sounded as the executioner held his head up to the crowd, and this signalled that a king was dead. A short distance away, locked up in a prison, Marie Antoinette fell to her knees and wept as she heard the cannon fire, and she knew her husband was dead. But in the moments after his death, Louis XVI's body and head was taken to a cemetery nearby, and he was thrown into the roughly dug grave. But in the decades after his death, the body and head of King Louis XVI was then searched for, and it was dug up, and what the investigators found was horrific and barbaric. But what did they find? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the key witnesses to the final moments of King Louis XVI was his confessor, a priest who remained with him on his final day. He said about the king as he made his way to the guillotine that the path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold. Silence by his look alone, 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pointe Tollante, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." On the scaffold, he was approached by the executioner and his assistant, and there were roughly 80,000 guards surrounding the execution structure to ensure there would be no trouble. The Place de la Révolution in Paris was packed with people, it was heavily crowded, and Louis XVI wanted to address the crowd, but he was deterred from doing this. He shouted out that, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." He was then strapped hurriedly onto the tilting board, and his neck was placed under the slanted blade of the guillotine. The executioner then released the blade, which fell with speed, and there has been some debate that the execution did not go well because of the rush of it. Some have claimed that instead of going through his neck, that the blade fell through the king's chin, shattering it on the way down, but nevertheless the king's head was taken clean off. His head was then displayed to the crowd, and one contemporary painting shows the king's head fastened to a pole, and the executioner thrust it high in the air to show everyone. Some guards even tried to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood as a souvenir. But then the required next step was to bury the king. His body and his head were placed on the back of a cart, and this was then driven off towards the old church of the Madeleine, a place where many enemies of the Revolution had been buried following their execution. The point of this was to make no special arrangements for King Louis XVI's death and body, but to bury him as a common criminal in the eyes of the revolutionaries. A short funeral service and memorial did take place inside of the church, and 2 priests who had sworn their utmost loyalty to the revolution were allowed to perform this short ceremony. Inside the graveyard there was a grave which had been dug by a group of gravediggers. This was not the deepest grave, and inside of it there was a bed of quicklime placed, aimed to quickly reduce Louis XVI's remains to virtually nothing. One of the priests who oversaw the burial said that, "I called for silence. A detachment of the gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by one of earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. After Louis's coffin was placed in the grave, further quicklime was then thrown on his remains, and the point of this was to make sure they decayed quicker and to make them disappear. It was intended for the king's burial place to remain secret, but this never worked, as it was very much well known where Louis XVI had been buried. There would be people who later even visited and paid their respects, and Louis had been buried in his shirt, waistcoat, breeches and stockings, and was interred roughly 10 feet from the wall of the cemetery, and the grave was not deep enough, and it was not 12 feet deep, which was required, and the grave was somewhat shallow. One of the grave diggers would later say that, when they arrived, I was still in the pit. I got out quickly and set to work with my spade on that pile of quicklime over there, where you can still see the traces. There were 5 bags of lime pellets. I mixed the lime into a paste and, with the help of another man, poured water on it so that it started to boil. The wooden coffins were there on the side, the great basket next to it. I pulled the body from the basket. I wanted to untie his hands, which were bound behind his back, but the deputies absolutely refused to let me, so I put him in just as he was, fully dressed, into his coffin. They hadn't cut off a single hair. His hair was curled and still attached with a comb, which is buried down there as well. I laid him out in his wooden coffin. He later also said he was missing only his shoes. He had a slightly dirty white waistcoat, his shirt, of course, grey breeches and silk stockings. Afterwards I picked up his head, which I placed on his neck. His eyes were open, and then we lowered him onto the bed of bubbling quicklime. The priests came forwards and said prayers, and then we put the lid on the coffin and added water and more lime pellets on top and sides. Finally, there was the earth, which you see. But it would not be long before there was a need to dig up the French king, and restoration of the monarchy called for this on the 18th of January 1815. The digging inside of the graveyard began, and the purpose of this was to give King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette somewhat of a decent burial, and they were to then be interred inside of the Basilica of St. Denis and the royal mausoleum containing the remains of many Bourbon rulers. The former gravediggers who had buried Louis were brought back to help if they were still alive, and inside of the Madeleine Cemetery the ground was broken. Marie Antoinette, the queen of Louis XVI, was found first on the first day, and her remains were discovered easily, and even her stockings were found, and some of her hair was allegedly still on her skull. But the discovery of King Louis XVI's remains came the following day. A deep trench was dug near to the wall, and the workers discovered several pieces of coffin, and they then found the skeleton of a man who had lost his head and who had wounds on his skull. The head had also been placed between the legs in the coffin, as Louis XVI had, and there was no clothing found. Now what had happened was that the quicklime added to the body had very much done its job, and partially dissolved the remains of the king, and his remains were heavily damaged by this, and were in such a bad state of decay. There was further searches in the region to search for other bodies, and it was generally accepted that the remains of King Louis XVI had been found, and that these were those of the king. It was said of the exhumation that, a deep trench nearer the wall being opened in our presence, we discovered some earth mingled with lime, and several small pieces of board indicated a coffin. The search was then carried out with the greatest care, but instead a bed of pure lime, as round the Queen's coffin, we found that the earth and lime had been mixed, but that there was a greater proportion of the latter substance. In the mixture of earth and lime we discovered the bones of a man, several of which were on the point of crumbling to dust. The skull was covered with lime and placed between the leg bones. Fragments of clothes were carefully looked for, but none were discovered. We collected all the remains and placed them together with some pieces of lime in a cloth brought from the purpose. Although the spot in which the body was found corresponded with that pointed out by the several eyewitnesses of the interment, and the situation of the head left no doubt to its identity, we nevertheless caused the group to be dug 12 deep feet to the distance of 25 feet in order to ascertain whether there was anywhere a bed of pure lime. No such bed being found was a corroboration of the proof, already satisfactory, that the remains we were in possession of were those of the king. The remains we then placed in a chest, which were then sealed with the arms of France, conveyed into the hall of M. Delaclos, and placed by the side of those of the queen. The priest continued to repeat the prayers of the church over the two bodies. As mentioned, the bodies of the king and queen were exhumed to give them a proper burial amongst the kings and queens of France inside the Basilica of St. Denis. A large funeral procession took place, where they were then laid to rest inside of a tomb, along with many other kings and queens. Their remains, surprisingly, had escaped being thrown into a river or being dumped into a pit during the Reign of Terror, and also in the subsequent years of the French Revolution, and many kings and queens had their bodies desecrated. It was said of their funeral that the princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistant, approached to the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and two priests, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service at St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. Still today, the remains of King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette are buried in a tomb inside the royal vault inside the Basilica of St. Denis. The exhumation of Louis XVI discovered the partial remains of a king who was very much regarded as an enemy of the people, and his execution wasn't just aimed to bring about the death of a specific king, but the intention was to bring about the complete end and desecration of the idea of the monarchy across France. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.